My name is Eric Höweler. I'm an associate professor here at the GSD. I'd like to welcome everyone back if you were here last night, or welcome you to the event if it's your first session. We have a great schedule this morning, 3 panels, 1 before lunch, 2 after lunch. Oops. Tricky stairs here. The first panel is on technology, and I actually was so thrilled last night with the discussion that sort of Grace kicked us off with. I think she set the bar extremely high for the kind of discussion that I hope we'll hear more about today. Maybe we can sort of pick up on some of the themes that was sort of started yesterday with questions of practice and modes of practice. Our panel today on technology includes historians and engineers. And it's intended to produce, like a kind of alchemy, a discussion about technology through the lens of history and engineering. Pei's work seems to be a particularly potent vehicle to be used as a catalyst for this type of experiment. As has already been noted, Pei's work combines an exacting precision of engineered solutions with careful attention to place, people, and local culture. Last semester in the spring, Harry Cobb was here for a session, and he showed Ieoh Pei's GSD master's thesis called A Museum of Chinese Art in Shanghai. And he showed that project in relationship to a number of Pei's projects, and he sort of brought them all back to his thesis, the Everson, the East Building, even the Louvre. And it was an incredible story to hear Harry talk about the thesis project as a launch pad for a whole career of practice. And he also pointed out that as Pei was a student of Gropius, that his thesis was a direct challenge to Gropius's pedagogy. I didn't know this, but Gropius didn't allow for the teaching of history in the GSD when he was chair, which is shocking. And Pei, coming from China, would ask, what about place? What about culture? What about site specificity? And apparently, and someone probably knows more than I do, but Gropius challenged Pei to say, prove it to me. If you think you can bring these things together productively, prove it to me. And I think the thesis came out of this desire to show that questions of place and questions of local culture were not irreconcilable with an agenda of modern architecture and a syntax of modern architecture. So Harry presented the thesis in the context of a publication and in the context of subsequent projects that showed a kind of evolution from the graduate thesis that Pei did here at the GSD to his other work and the preoccupations that sort of drove his work throughout his whole career. So I think the takeaway from Harry Cobb's lecture was that the work being done by students at the GSD is not merely academic projects, but that they can be and should be the initial articulation of a lifelong project. Ieoh's thesis and the rich body of work confirm that themes of site specificity, history, continuity, identity, and tradition, landscape, and architecture were all first articulated in his GSD master's thesis of 1946. So one of the narratives we hear often about Pei and the work of the firm is the question of detail and insistence on quality. Last night, Sandy said that he's not interested in the size of a firm, but in the quality of the work. Harry Cobb noted in the spring that the firm's expertise in construction systems, namely concrete, differentiated the firm. And in the same panel, Didi Pei described almost a fanatical knowledge of concrete construction. The color, the texture, the aggregate, the spacing of the boards, the technique used to bush hammer, all these were combined to achieve a specific texture, appearance, and effect. So just to sort of frame the discussion before I let the speakers present their papers, if the firm, in its many iterations, gathers expertise within it, pooling it, leveraging it, applying it, the firm has no need for consultants. They have expertise in-house. They wrote their own specifications. I wondered to myself, how do we train experts? Within the academy, we think of research and the production of knowledge. And in that conference in the spring, Scott Cohen asked the question, how is the firm like a school? How does the school produce knowledge? How does it produce expertise? And how might we think about the production of knowledge and expertise within the profession? So how does the professional practice produce knowledge? How does it transmit it? And I'm hoping that the panelists today will sort of talk a little bit about that. I'm struck with the tremendous innovations that the firm pioneered. Technical innovations, the use of structural silicone for curtain wall glazing, innovations in the cable truss facade systems at the Louvre, innovations in point-supported glass, innovations in space frames, gaskets, cast-in-place concrete, stone anchoring. Pei's office, it seems, was an R&D center for building technologies. I can't help but think how this innovation comes with risk. And in our risk-averse society, how does the profession manage risk and innovation in an industry where failure can mean lawsuits or worse? Is there a general shift from these innovative technical practices in light of the building industry today, and its shift away from the R&D type of work that we saw and admired so much about Pei's early practice? So one of the things I'd like to talk about with the panelists after they present is questions of the building industry. How do we sort of update this model of an R&D practice, innovative in terms of technology and its applications? Oh, you know, I should be advancing my slides. I totally forgot. Okay, so this was Harry back in the spring showing the museum in Shanghai, and it had a particular Chinese quality, but the expression was distinctly modern. So the composition was remarkable in the sort of relationship between spaces. But the vocabulary, the syntax was kind of Gropius. The sensibility was entirely Pei. So what Harry was saying was that Pei had somehow managed to sort of both challenge the chair and his pedagogy, the pedagogy at the school, and produce a work that would carry the practice through many of these projects. So here was the conference back in the spring. And then one of the things I wanted to do, I wondered about these questions of risk. I wondered about the story of Ieoh Pei and his training at the GSD, but also his training at MIT. You know, a lot of the narratives about Pei talk about how he studied engineering at MIT before coming to the GSD. And Harry did such a great job looking at his thesis at the GSD, and I was just talking about the MIT thesis. And so last night after dinner and dessert, I went home and I thought about this, and I thought, what did his undergraduate thesis look like? And is there anything there that might tell us something? So late last night, I dug up Ieoh Pei's undergraduate thesis. And it's called Standard Propaganda Units for Wartime and Peacetime in China, submitted for partial fulfillment of the requirements of the degree of Bachelor of Architecture, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, School of Architecture, Ieoh Ming Pei, June 1940. The thesis is 27 pages long, neatly typed. He begins by describing the role of propaganda as a scheme of a plan for the propagation of a doctrine of systems or principles. He's talking about a system, and I think that's something that sort of we think about when we think of Ieoh Pei, we think about systematic thinking. Then he describes the current conditions in China, the illiteracy rates, the situation in rural areas. He sees propaganda as a program and a means of promoting education, sanitation, social and economic reorganization, as well as nationalism. So after a careful analysis of the program, consisting of a main hall for theatrical productions, general exhibition space, an outdoor forum, an animals and carts shed, Pei sets out to develop a construction system suited to the context, using available materials, local labor, and innovative construction techniques. Pei systematically analyzes existing structural and material properties of bamboo. Compressive strength, 5,740 pounds per square inch. So he gets into the details. This is a kind of engineering approach, a systems approach. Under technical considerations, he states, realizing that materials and methods of construction will have a controlling influence over the plan, no attempt was given to study the plan elements prior to the choice of proper materials that are technically and economically satisfactory. So this is Ieoh Pei. He's 23 years old. He's articulating an idea about how to proceed with the design problem and privileging materials and methods, or means and methods, over form making. 23 years old. As an undergrad at MIT, he's establishing a set of guiding principles around questions of technology, workflow, and prioritization. One last point before I hand it over to the historians. Pei's thesis contains 4 drawings: a site plan, 2 sections, and a diagram. He analyzes 2 spanning systems. This is system A, a suspension system, and system B, a bowstring arch. His analysis of the options he has developed leads him to conclude that the bowstring arch system is appropriate to bamboo construction. It combines the availability of an abundant and pliable material that gains its strength and spanning capacity through an arch-like form, and combined with a tension tie across the bottom, creates a lightweight spanning system. This is the final diagram. So I'm not a historian or an engineer, but I find this fascinating, how a young undergraduate at MIT, 23 years old, is already articulating an idea about building technology. He's developing an expertise, he's developing a sensibility. And as I think Harry Cobb demonstrated in his presentation in the spring, the work that students are producing in their education is of consequence. It can, as a student work of Ieoh Ming Pei, articulate an attitude towards culture and context, but also technology, design, workflows, and values. So that's just a, so I have some more slides. Very quickly then. So how did the bowstring arch anticipate the bowstring truss? How did that understanding of material economy appropriateness anticipate this work, which was radical at the time? And I think Annette's going to tell us more about this project. But I was struck last night, or maybe it was early morning, by the fact that these drawings, this sensibility, this attitude towards building technology might have had its early influence, and here we see the bowstring trusses that are supporting the inverted pyramid, and these sort of observations of a 23-year-old IM. So that was my sort of initial provocation. My next job is to introduce our actual speakers. So I'm very happy to introduce our panel. I had a chance to chat with each of them a little bit last night and this morning. So our first speaker is Janet Adams-Strong. Janet's an architectural historian and holds a PhD from Brown University. She was engaged to write for Ieoh Ming Pei and Partners in 1986 and continued at the firm, now Pei Freedom Partners, for more than 20 years as a documentalist and a director of communications. Strong has independently authored, co-authored, and edited more than a dozen books on architecture, including Ieoh Ming Pei Complete Works of 2008. So I'd like to welcome Janet Adams-Strong.
Hi, good morning. Let's see. This is an image that everyone will have seared in their minds by the end of the day. In any event, I.M. once told me that he was a practical dreamer and that he didn't dream things that couldn't be built. How to realize those dreams was the work of the firm, often cited as his greatest creation. I.M. established an environment, and this goes back to a lot of what was being said yesterday. He established an environment that encouraged technical advancement, honesty of materials, refinement, simplicity, dedication to the craft of building, and a drive to perfection. And because people tended to stay at the firm for a very long time, sometimes for their entire career, there was a pool of knowledge and there was a pool of trust and creativity that was a wellspring of the firm's work. I.M.'s, I.M.'s GSD thesis for a new museum in Shanghai is invariably cited as a precursor of his future work. But I would like to suggest that that was also the case with his undergraduate thesis at MIT. Both in his focus on exhibitions, popular culture, interest in the particularities of place, and technical development. Proposed were portable structures that would travel into the countryside in order to reach people who had fled from civil war. Most of the people were illiterate, I think 80% of the population at the time, and therefore there would be colored banners that would advertise or announce what was going to happen, what the events were. And it was not only entertainment, it was education, it was about sanitation, it was about news, it was a new community center, as it were. The units were to be constructed with bamboo, following Pei's investigation of wood, steel, and for my purposes here today, concrete. Following graduation, IM took a crisscrossed the United States in an 8,000-mile road trip, visiting manufacturers of prefab building materials with the idea that he would introduce these when he returned to China. The trip was really significant because it began his long-term practice, his lifelong practice of working directly with manufacturers. Back in Boston, he worked as a concrete designer at Stone & Webster before enrolling in GSD, and very much buoyed by lectures by Le Corbusier in 1935 in Boston. Corbu, as IM recalls, he was arrogant, he was abusive, he was insolent, and he shocked, these IM's words, he shocked us out of complacency. For me, it was the beginning of change. Pei spent the rest of his school year studying Le Corbusier's œuvre complète, and indeed, his radiant farm, which you see up at the top here, and his pavillon de nouveau temps were both reflected in IM's thesis. Here with these temporary riggings, which IM also used there, and also the inclusion of the farm animals, segments of it, and the technology. The impact of Le Corbusier's books is difficult to overstate. And as an aside, but a really important aside, is the fact that IM didn't publish. He preferred to have his buildings speak for themselves. And so unlike Le Corbusier, he did not provide students materials, study tools for young architects, no dialectics for classroom discussion, with the result that aside from the veteran architects in his firm, there's really no school of Pei. And indeed, until now, until this very symposium, there's been no real substantive academic exploration of his work. IM's introduction to modernism continued at GSD with Gropius over on the left, and Breuer, and Mies and Wright at the other end of the spectrum. As he said, it was all very foreign to those of us brought up on a Beaux-Arts symmetry. It was like walking into a candy store. Which one to buy? In the end, you buy all of them, and then make something out of it that is your own. 2 years after graduation, IM joined the visionary New York developer William Zeckendorf over here on the right. Again, imagining that all of the lessons he would learn about real estate, he would take back to him with China. Zeckendorf was a visionary. He thought in big, bold terms. Some people would say impossible terms. But the projects he was interested in were not these tiny parcels in the city, but gigantic, gigantic developments. His problem invariably was financing, because the banks, the lenders, always wanted safe investments. Zeckendorf protested in a talk he called Baked Buildings, which he delivered here, or at least in GSD, in 1951. And he decried speculative builders and developers for, as he said, borrowing as much as possible, designing as cheaply as possible, and building as inexpensively as possible, and never mind the rest. Lenders wanted the same kind of buildings that had been baked for the last 25 years. So in 1949, the Federal Redevelopment Act was passed, and it encouraged, even required, more of the same kind of building. But for Zeckendorf, this act represented free money. It freed him from his reliance on the banks. Now it came from the government. And so overnight, Zeckendorf became the biggest redeveloper in the country. And he shared with IM his interest in becoming the General Motors of urban renewal. Kips Bay was one of the first of Zeckendorf's redevelopments. And he dispatched IM to Stuyvesant Town, which is here. And you can, Stuyvesant's down in Peter Cooper Village, but you can see this two-step slabs over here. That's Kips Bay. So he sent IM to Stuyvesant Town to study it because he thought of it as the model for urban renewal. And it was developed by the head of Metropolitan Life, who happened to be Zeckendorf's major lender. But when IM went there, he said it suffered from projectitis. It was anonymous. There were too many buildings. There was no distinction. And so in a way that's been lost to history, maybe except as testament to IM's legendary powers of persuasion. He convinced Zeckendorf that bricklaying was increasingly inefficient and that the future demanded an entirely new way of building. You know, when you think of it, it's an incredible argument. And in fact, IM later admitted it wasn't accurate. But it was the big kind of thinking that Zeckendorf was inclined to adopt. So IM stressed that the standard skin and bones kind of practice of building a structural frame and then covering it with brick was actually a really extravagant way to build. And so his idea was to combine structure and finish in an integral whole. This would become both the ethic and the aesthetic of his architecture. At this point, I'd like to just quickly pop to Denver to look at a couple of buildings. This mile high, mile high over here, a 21-story Miesian tower, which kind of jump-started the redevelopment of downtown. And on the right, Courthouse Square, and this was a pioneering mixed-use complex in downtown city. For my purposes today, I'd like to suggest that the greater importance of these two projects was as the seed of the development of IM's development of architectural concrete. Both include thin shell construction. Over here, this one, but with Kahn and Jacobs in association, and down here, Kahn and Jacobs were pioneers of exposed concrete, this being their asphalt plant of 1942. And the other one, this was the largest hyperbolic paraboloid in the country, designed by Anton Tedesco. So equally innovative was the Denver Hilton, which is back here. This is a department store, and this is the Hilton back here. The Denver Hilton was the first precast concrete building of any size in the country. And its facade is built up out of these gigantic 2-ton window frames stacked one on top of the other. It was a tremendous structural breakthrough, but still it was structure and skin, without the singularity that would ultimately drive architectural concrete. Now for that, we might look to Fred Severid, who was a public housing specialist. He was an outspoken critic and proponent, of cast-in-place concrete, and he just so happened to be the structural engineer for this building. So there was an awful lot going on in Denver. It all came together in Kips Bay. This is not it, but Pei's knowledge of concrete, which had been growing over the years, was now reinforced by Aldo Cassuto, who'd worked with Corbu in 1949 when L'Unité d'Habitation was in progress. And so IM was interested in Corbu's, in his sculptural forms, in his potential for monumentality, in his dramatic lights and shadows, but he objected to the crudeness of his concrete and the dark coloring. So he looked to Mies. And Mies was right then, and we're talking about late 1950s, right then was developing the Colonnade apartments in Newark, New Jersey. Here you can see the apartments here in Newark, and back there is New York. So it was really very close, and everyone was very conscious of what was going on. The budget for Kips Bay could not support a steel curtain wall. Because after all, it was urban renewal housing. But as IM acknowledged, Mies started us thinking about doing things with an economy of means. Now, Mies was brought into the office by the three Fs, all of them students from IIT: Brooks Friedman, Ed Friedman, and James Fried, who had not only studied with Mies, but also had worked with him on the Seagram building. So in truth, Jim played only a minor role in the Seagram, actually on the plaza. But he came with great confidence and a personal knowledge of Mies's first residential high-rise, the Promontory, over there on the left, in Chicago, which was completed with an exposed concrete frame in 1949. Mies had wanted a steel and glass curtain wall, but the bankers refused to believe that any person would ever willingly live in it. And so, in a bid to get financing, Mies came around and he inserted brick spandrels and end walls. The promontory, I don't know if you can see it here, but the promontory steps back in, I think it's 4 different progressions, in clear reduction of the lessening of its load. And Kips Bay does exactly the same thing, but its facade is completely flush. And so instead of stepping back, the apartments on the upper floors step out. And so you end up with larger apartments on the inside. It's a little bit like out-Miesing Mies. The breakthrough came with Lakeshore Drive very shortly thereafter, and also in Kips Bay, with these nearly floor-to-ceiling windows. The critical difference, and it really was critical, was that Mies was doing high-end apartments. As urban renewal development, Kips Bay was absolutely unprecedented. And it delivered light, it delivered expansive views, a great sense of open space in the city. It was the promise of modernism. And its windows were absolutely defining. Although, as Zeckendorf's model apartments show, not everybody knew what to do with them. Kips Bay is all bone and muscle, no fat. Everything was reduced to essentials, even to the elimination of window frames, so that the giant panes of glass were inserted directly into the concrete wall. This was made possible by the curved corners. You can see them over on the left, which were set behind the column faces to produce a very rigid frame, every element in clear relationship to every other element. As in I Am systematic or stylistic candy store, Kips Bay combined influences, as we've seen, from Mies and Le Corbusier, but also from Frank Lloyd Wright, to whom team members attributed the radiused window heads. Certainly, all eyes were on the Guggenheim Museum, which was then under construction. But interestingly, as a nemesis, since the gunite exterior was hand-troweled and then had to be painted in order to hide blemishes. And here you can see right behind Mr. Wright, these people doing exactly that, hiding up their work. As I.M. would say, if you cut into the Guggenheim, you'll find layers and layers of mistakes in concrete. Just in passing, Wright was also very firmly in mind in 1958, as it was then that I.M. convinced Zeckendorf to buy the Roby House to prevent its demolition. Meanwhile, while all of this was going on, I.M. Became immersed in FHA bureaucracy. And this is a huge story, a very complex story, but suffice it to say that in an enormous achievement, he won subsidies for Kips Bay's deep window embrasures and thereby secured additional financing for Zeckendorf to the tune of about $15 million. Even so, Zeckendorf's senior management here, and you see I.M. in the back and Zeckendorf over here, they were not in any way interested in this kind of breakthrough. They wanted buildings without architecture, imitation, no innovation. That's what made money. And in this, they were reinforced by contractors who had absolutely no interest in doing things in any way different than as they had been doing. So when it came out to put Kips Bay out to bid, they costed it at about between $17 and $18 a square foot, which was double its budget, and enough to kill the project. But then Zeckendorf, ever irrepressible, he bought a company called Industrial Engineering. It was a concrete pouring company. They did highways and they did dams. And he had purchased them so that they would build Kips Bay. And with it, he won IM's undying loyalty. By 1960, architects were using cast-in-place concrete so much to the degree that Ada Louise Huxtable of the New York Times declared it the unparalleled opportunity of our time. But unlike these one-off designs, what Pei sought was a low-cost, repetitive building unit, in effect, a modern alternative to brick, but akin in color and in quality to limestone. Mass-produced concrete housing was not new. As early as 1970, Thomas Edison patented a system to pour an entire house in a single day. It included floors, ceilings, roofs, bathtubs, pianos, everything. And it would sell for a very affordable price of about $1,200. But the system, requiring about 2,000 cast iron molds, all bolted together, was not only heavy and labor-intensive, but it would cost contractors about, well, the equivalent of about $4.5 million for startup. Didn't catch on. But the critical distinction here, and this really is key, is that Edison was using concrete to mimic traditional forms, whereas IM was trying to invent an entirely new system. A lot was known about structural concrete, but there was a great deal of uncertainty about its architectural implications. It was thought of as an artificial stone, somehow second best and exposed and undressed, and because its appearances were not considered important in infrastructure, its typical use, it conjured up visions of streaked and unlovely surfaces. But, as I am explained, Kips Bay was not going to be just any old piece of sidewalk. And so he looked to the revolutionary and very artful bridges of Robert Maillard. Pei mobilized his staff to learn all about concrete with the help of the industry, the concrete industry was very eager, having been kind of marginalized by the flat surfaces of the international style. So they're very eager to jump in and help. And Old Man Hogan, who was the head of the Portland Cement Association, was a regular visitor at the firm. It continued the whole process, the practice that I had of working directly with manufacturers. And it also reinforced his practice of seeking out seasoned veterans who knew how to build, because most architects in the early firm came from GSD, steeped in design, but without much or any knowledge of construction. Okay, I have to race. Without today's sophisticated admixture technologies, concrete in the late 1950s basically consisted of cement, which was the binding agent or the glue, aggregate, which was sand or gravel, crushed rock, and water. That's it. It was the least predictable of all building materials since, unlike brick or curtain wall, which is factory produced and then delivered ready for use, concrete was produced on site using raw materials and local labor, who usually were unfamiliar with fine finish techniques. Architectural concrete was poured into a form, and what came out was the building. Mistakes were almost impossible to hide. So the Pei office tested various mixes. They tested colors and material sources. And with Reg Hoff, who went on to become a leading architectural concrete consultant, they established libraries of different sands, of different aggregates and cements from all over the country. The prime of all of it was sailor cement, which was a light buff color from the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, as opposed to the standard cement, which was kind of a drab gray color. They experimented with setting times, with pouring and vibration times, with air entrainment, with surface treatment, cleaning techniques. And unlike most other architects, they paid careful attention to the effects of cracking and aging, weather and life cycles, even pollution. They tested formwork materials and methods to prevent leaking and discoloration. They developed gasketing systems, clamping, bracing, easy release techniques so that the forms could be reused, and to ensure that the corners and the crisp edges would remain. They investigated liners, here with an epic trick, trip to an auto manufacturer in Flint, Michigan, in order to learn about fiberglass linings for forms. Ultimately, Pei hired a cabinet maker to fabricate the wooden forms as if they were fine furniture, perhaps being the first architect to ever specify working drawings for molds. Their surface impact simply had not been considered in the past. And then, of course, there was the full-scale mock-up. Here, in this kind of Kipps Bay version of the Vitruvian Man, test beds were where contractors tried out the building's typical and most difficult conditions, and it was also where they gained experience for the actual building. Contractors invariably balked at the expense, but they almost always ended up saving money because this is where they detected the problems. Further consideration was the whole issue of documentation and oversight, of translating intent and experience into drawings, and the creation of specifications from scratch. All of the many variables involved separate operations, but all were interrelated. To be sure, the quality of the materials was critical, but even more important was the process, which had to be developed step by step, to the point that the firm knew more about what could be done and how to do it, well, very frequently to the consternation of contractors. Kipps Bay made architectural concrete mainstream, and its specifications were soon adopted as industry standards. For the Pei office, it was the topic of discussion. It was a common bond within the firm. Although it's interesting that very few of the architects in this kind of context where design was paramount, very few of them ever wanted to go into concrete themselves. IM built his firm on Kipps Bay, and for a period of about 10 or 15 years, almost all of his work was in architectural concrete. Now, I focused on Kipps Bay largely because it's the Rosetta Stone. And because of time, they omitted all discussion of context, of site planning, of landscape, of integration, of monumental art, all of which are kind of critical to the project's success. I think I'm out of time and I have to shut off, and I'm very sorry about that. I'm really very sorry. I just, indulge me 1 second, because I just want to show that these were some architects on the team who wanted to follow Corbeau in their ideas for Luce Chapel, and I am, of course, insisted on something much simpler. The whole idea, simplicity at all costs. Integral design, not interior design. Those were recurring mantras. I mean, it doesn't get much simpler than that. Okay, I can't. I want to really scoot by past NCAR. I see other people will be discussing that, but I want to talk just for 1 second, if you will, about Everson Museum, because it was such an incredible breakthrough, which is in Syracuse. And as at NCAR, scale was a real issue because this was in the middle of an urban renewal area, and so scale was undefined. But unlike NCAR, with its complex scientific requirements, Everson was completely unencumbered. It had virtually no program, it had very little money, and it had no collection. So IM was left, in the absence of constraints, it was left to explore sculptural expression, to transform the original scheme for dramatic impact. And the snorkels, these cantilevers, originally faced inward. And he was able to turn them outward and really explore sculptural form. And he explored light and he explored space here in a way that he'd not done before. And also movement. And you see over here on the left, it was originally a dog-leg stair, and he transformed it into this kind of experiential spiral. He pushed the limits of the structural system to the point where he was really exploiting the strength of the unbroken walls of these great cantilevers, and to experiment in monolithic form. The monumentality of the architectural concrete was pushed further too, and bush hammering was perfected. Here, instead of just straight up and down vertically as in NCAR, here it was done on a diagonal, and it was introduced also right along the edges, because if you keep bush hammering at the corners, you crack the edges. And so they developed this sandblasted border to protect the crisp contours. And on the interior, they introduced a whole new palette of different treatments. Here with the bush hammering, here with board forming. There are other elements here which are just flat surface treatments. There were different treatments on the stairwell, in the coffers. I mean, here you have just an incredible palette of architectural treatments, of concrete treatments. None of them by itself is much of anything, but together they made really extraordinarily rich an experience, architectural experience. And I would posit that it was here in Everson that Ieoh Pei Associates became real impresarios of architectural concrete. I'm not going to go any further, much as I'd like, except to suggest to you that Everson and Des Moines Art Center were kind of the culmination of Ieoh's development of architectural concrete. It stopped when he came to the National Gallery. The National Gallery was the culmination of those experiments, but it was also the end because Paul Mellon required that the building be done in Tennessee limestone in order to match the original National Gallery. And so hereafter, what you find is Ieoh would use architectural concrete as a feature element, mostly for long spans, here in all the bridges and these lead pieces. Here in the coffers, I mean, the development to the highest of qualities. On the top, the limestone, here, the board form concrete. And you can see here that this is a graph I started to track the development, and all right here are all these architectural concrete buildings, and after the National Gallery, which is up here, you can see they just become spots. They become, again, very, very fine, precious elements, in part because of the cost involved. They had become so refined. Ieoh had made the total transformation from a crude, raw material into something so fine that basically was priced out of the market. And he continued that at the Louvre, at Miho, at Doha, and I want to say, this, I had to show this to you, for Ieoh's 100th birthday, this board game was developed, and it documents many of these projects, many of his greatest achievements, but it also documents the liabilities of architectural concrete. Thank you. I apologize for going too late.
Thank you, Janet. That was incredible. We didn't want you to stop either. But maybe we can pick that up again during the discussion. Our next speaker is Annette Fierro. Annette is an associate professor and associate chair of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches design, technology, and urbanism. She's a registered architect and an engineer by training. In 2003, she published Glass State, The Technology of Spectacle, Paris 1981 to 98 with MIT Press. Forthcoming is her book on the avant-garde of Britain in the 1960s and its legacies in the architecture of British high-tech. Annette.
Thank you very much. I've been kindly asked to represent this piece of writing, completed some time ago, on Ieoh Pei's most significant, or one of most significant, if not the most significant work, the Grande Pyramide du Louvre, completed in Paris in 1989. Now, the larger writing addressed the Louvre within the context of Mitterrand's other grand projets, which were transparent and glass, and embraced all kinds of topics of politics, material symbolism, technology. How does one commission compete in prominence to the renovation of the Louvre, however, in international, historical, and cultural significance? It is impossible. But as I hope to show, the project also completes and expands upon many themes of Ieoh Pei's work on its own, so much that I will coin from the beginning that it represents his crystalline grail, therefore having a mystical connotation. To do so, in this talk, I will occasionally compare it to several of his other projects, roughly contemporary to the Louvre, all of which are cultural institutions, all with prominent glass elements, typically roofs or atriums in binary opposition to the opaque underworlds that contain the actual displays of artifacts. In all of these works, materializing a geometric volume which aspires to transparency to different degrees and for different purposes represents a basic and well-worn conundrum. Now, the buildings which I've chosen to add to the mix today are the JFK Library, here in Boston, of course, completed in 1979, the Cleveland Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, completed in 1995, the Miho Museum in Koka, Japan, of 1997, and the German Historical Museum in 2003, some 14 years after the Louvre, but a return to a major European capital in a significant urban setting. Now, the Grand Pyramid, however, is unquestionably the most significant of these buildings, establishing new forms of symbolism and monumentality in Paris, a city which, after all, defined those concepts. In France, the Louvre is acknowledged not simply as a national museum or even the former residence of the king, but as a literal embodiment of the history of the nation. Jean-Pierre Bablon notes that the only constant in the Louvre's long history of rebuilding was a supersaturation of symbolic content. While the palace functioned as actual dwelling of the frequently absent monarchs inconsistently, it fulfilled the king's obligation to his subjects to be seen. The building represented, expressed, and literalized the subject of the monarch, whose presence was encrusted in many decorative royal motifs. As the symbol of the king, the Louvre was the focus of considerable upheaval during the Revolution, taken over during the first stages of the revolt. The opening of the Louvre as the cultural repository of France for use by the general public signified the ascent of the new democracy to sovereign governance. The Louvre not only overcame symbolizing the monarchy, it continues to signify all of France itself. According to Émile Biazini, Mitterrand's Minister of Public Works for the Grand Projet, the Louvre occupies the subconscious of France. Now, equal to its historical significance, the Louvre's termination of the Voie Triomphale reiterates its cultural prominence. The Voie, a seemingly infinite line, extends westward from the Louvre, passing through various monuments and urban parks, and finally to the Arch de la Défense, across the boundary of Paris proper. The Louvre, therefore, sits as the climax of the most famous urban axis in the world. Now, François Mitterrand and Ieoh Pei understood that the circumstances surrounding the Louvre constituted the most highly charged setting imaginable. Mitterrand dispensed with the customary competition process to choose an architect out of unwillingness to put the design at the mercy of the whims of an unpredictable jury. The initial contact between Mitterrand and Pei and the ensuing months of preliminary research and design were cloaked in absolute secrecy, even from Pei's office, for fear that any amount of publicity would compromise the potential of the project. The fears were well-founded. In a series of highly publicized confrontations between Mitterrand, the French public and press, and various elements of the French government, it became evident that the symbolic mantle of the Louvre would be appropriated by all the parties assuming roles as the protectorate of the institution. For the public, the intervention of modern architecture into the heart of the old city was painfully reminiscent of earlier fiascos instigated by Georges Pompidou, especially the hated Tour de Montparnasse and the destruction of the beloved Baltard marketplaces at Les Halles. Said Jacques Lang, the Minister of Culture at the time, Quote, "In France, a kind of conservatism exists that is paired with ignorance. There's nothing like contemporary architecture to get all the vehemence going. It's a French sickness." Now, academicians also found that the sudden imposition of modern architecture within the Louvre complex offensive, not so much for its contemporary style as for the abrupt departure from the building's diachronic development, an accrual of fragments and layers over the previous 800 years. For the political right, the pyramid came to represent the ascent of the socialist left, regarded as monstrous by still lingering monarchists. The initial vociferous protests ranged from a unanimous rejection by the influential Historic Monuments Commission to anti-American and blatantly xenophobic personal attacks in the media against Ieoh Pei. Not only was a contemporary image of the pyramid labeled a sign of, quote, deculturalization, a humiliation of French masters Perrault and Soufflot, but so was the shift in the institutional nature of the Louvre from a national museum to a, quote, pseudo-cultural supermarket, quote, seen as a pandering to the economy of international tourism. The degree of the clamor underscores the sophistication of the counteroffensive immediately put into place by Mitterrand and Biazini. By mobilizing the unanimous support of the museum curators and prominent French cultural figures, the composer Pierre Boulez and Claude Pompidou key among them, and allaying public fears by building in situ a full-scale mock-up of the pyramid in steel cables, the tide of public opinion began to sway in support of Pei's design. Now, with the Louvre as its vortex, the socio-political and historical issues swirling around the project were belied by Pei's dramatically simple concept. Even before the revolution, the occupation of the building had been consistently hybridized. And just before the renovation had included offices for the National Lottery and for the Ministry of Finance, rendering circulation through exhibition galleries hopelessly circuitous. Unity, how's that for a floor plan? So unity and clarity of organization of the entire Louvre complex would be finally achieved by reclaiming all of the existing wings of the U-shaped building and taking advantage of the space under the central Cour Napoleon. Pei positioned the pyramid above a vast new underground lobby connecting all of the different wings. Now, if the reorganization of the building seemed guided by a clever artlessness, the shape of the pyramid, too, was presented as if arising naturally from a set of given circumstances. Pei stated to his French audience that his source of inspiration for pyramidal geometry was the classical geometry of Le Nôtre's plans of the Tuileries. Perhaps so, but Pei's prior work confirmed a general tendency toward abstract geometry as the dominant agent in configuring all of his buildings, from that at the scale of the site to the demands that that geometry makes at the scale of the joint. From the early John F. K. Kennedy Library in Boston, his buildings are consistently distinguished as large prismatic forms articulated with angular faceting. The clean lines which terminate the geometric forms of the exterior connote a particular monumentality, with a sense of minimizing, making absolute, non-negotiable correctness of volumes transposed against each other. Through a thorough command of surface, light, and edge, Pei persuades the viewer of the primordial nature of geometry. At JFK, three perfect shapes interlock in plan: a square, a circle, and an equilateral triangle, all of which are extruded upward, with only the square becoming a cubic volume, though sliced clean through by the triangular administrative tower. The cube is the central ceremonial space. It looks out at the bay, recreating the gaze of Kennedy out to the sea. It is thus a memorial as well as a library, the embodied subject of the beloved president, as much as the Louvre was originally of the monarchy. The Cleveland Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, another pyramid, or at least a tetrahedron on its side, hardly provides the same solemn setting. Does this American pyramid perform a similar symbolic function? Perhaps. As enshrined within are the annual inductees, which include a royalty of a different sort. David Bowie, The Clash, and Patti Smith, those are my favorites, are to be found here rather than Delacroix or Kennedy. As in JFK, there is a similar condensation of geometric elements toward the lake, beginning with a doubly transposed pyramidal volume, the entry lobby, adjacent to another opaque administrative tower, and a circular auditorium raised as a sculptural element to enliven the waterfront edge. To resolve the adjacency between the two main geometries, Pei designs interior porches protruding from the opaque masses through which the crowds circulate. At the Miho Museum, which holds a private collection of Japanese cultural artifacts, we see another ceremonial space, less a juxtaposition of elemental shapes than a three-dimensional overlay of tetrahedral geometries. Inspired by the heavily structured ceilings of Edo period farmhouses, the tetrahedral structure is suspended just above the interior spaces, defining their spatiality and sense of interiority. At first glance, the Berlin Historical Museum is different. The exterior of the building is not generated by extruded geometries, but hidden in the floor plan is a defining triangle which structures the interior spaces. Here also, a protruding circle turns into a spiral stair, resolving the building's corner and providing a hinge for the adjacent main entry. As for the latent symbolism, we find only a few cast-off references, a tribute to Khan and the spiral stair, an emblem or perhaps a motif, a curiosity reminiscent of a very divergent political moment, perhaps a ghost of the Third International. Probably not. It is significant that of the buildings which were motivated by the purity of symbolic function, JFK and the Louvre, the transparent volume of space resides far above the crowds. The spaces are discrete and separate, they are autonomous, they call forth a solemn other, a space which is never to be entered physically. In distinction, at the museums of Cleveland, Miho, and Berlin, circulation is emphatically disposed within the transparent volumes or just underneath them. Now, the exteriors of the other buildings are composite configurations, making them quite distinct from the Louvre, where the singularity of the pyramidal geometry acted as a central claim to neutrality. Against the highly charged sculptural facades of the existing Louvre, as an elemental shape, the pyramid would provide a mute foil. To confirm its unobtrusiveness, Pei also asserted that through the pyramidal geometry, the mass of the building would diminish vertically. By proposing that it would be constructed of glass, Pei further asserted that its neutrality would be complete. Now, in pursuing transparency, the issues of geometry in Pei's prisms are pushed into a higher realm of idealization offered by the properties of the crystalline, to which we'll return later. None of the other museums comprise this quest for geometric clarity and perfection to such a degree. They are composed and overlaid volumes, deploying geometry, but not reifying its absolute nature. In the development of the material and structural systems, the artlessness displayed in Pei's pyramid finally began to give way, and profoundly important discrepancies emerged between idealization and everything that seemed to comprise it, from systems of construction to experiential dimension and programmatic necessity. Beginning with the largest and clearest possible panes of glass, the diamond geometry represented the most coherent division of the triangular flanks. Note the very different panels here in the Cleveland Museum, whose panels are ultimately articulated as orthogonal squares. No doubt a consideration of expense, but something which Mike Flynn recently commented to me, quote, simply doesn't look right. Now, after considerable research, the French glass company Saint-Gobain Vitrage opted to use pure white sand from the quarries of nearby Fontainebleau. Building a special furnace to omit the addition of iron oxide, Saint-Gobain yielded a glass product with optical characteristics close to that of lead crystal. At this maximum limit of transparency, the green line was eliminated that would otherwise be visible at the edge of glass when viewed obliquely in the inclined faces. Finally, the glass was transported back and forth to the UK, where special facilities polished the surfaces for greatest planarity. These extreme measures to achieve maximum transparency speak not only of the Louvre's preeminence, but also of the appetite of the designers to attain an unprecedented perfection of surface and material. In contrast, note the darkness of the glass at JFK. Not only out of, not only out of practicality, but in the late 1970s, this did not accommodate the required environmental protection. Because of this, the space of the cube is dramatically more interiorized, lessening the view to the bay and thus ultimately the pathos in realizing the gaze of the slain president. Now at Miho, in complete contrast, Pei and his team develop a highly refined system of shading to cope with the sun. But here, since there was never a desire for pure transparency, this coincides with recreating the interiority of Japanese space, manifested through filtered light. At the Louvre, every effort was made to minimize the presence of the primary structure and glazing support systems. The structure, a series of stainless steel bowstring trusses spanning diagonally in two directions, is placed exactly behind and normal to the divisions of the diamond planes. The loads imposed on the glass are thus transferred directly to the trusses, relieving the mullions of any structural obligation and reducing their dimension to that needed only to hold the glass panel and provide weatherproofing. With the arrival of the famous engineering firm Rice Francis Ritchie came the redesign of the truss intersection joints as curvilinear nodal elements cast out of stainless steel, recalling that Peter Rice had also been behind the sculptural plasticity of the Centre Pompidou's structural members. Now, the refinement of the primary and glass structural systems in response to this higher goal is without parallel in any of the other buildings. The mullions at Cleveland and JFK interrupt the glass surface, and their tubular steel trusses are simply no match for the technical prowess and exfoliated elegance of those at the Louvre. While the planarity of the glass at the Berlin Museum is elegantly constrained, there is no equal to the precision of the structural solution of the Louvre. Perhaps the only equivalence is found at Miho, where the overlay of the tetrahedral spaces and structural elements coincide with the elegant simplicity of the aluminum chosen for the structural space frame and the distinctive planarity that the shading system gives to the original geometry. Now, reportedly, Ieoh Pei's greatest dissatisfaction at the Louvre was the relatively high level of opacity produced by the reflections of the sky on the panes of the glass. Despite all the extreme measures taken to promote its transparency, the geometry of the pyramid imposed an unavoidable condition. Because the determining factor of reflectivity is the difference between interior and exterior levels of light. When tilted at an angle, even on overcast days, the light of the sky would always be far brighter, making the glass highly reflective. By positioning the primary structure to fall precisely behind the edges of the glass planes, the pyramid's transparency was intended not only to minimize structure, but to maximize unobstructed views. So since the structural systems occupy considerable depth, however, behind the glass surfaces, the purity of the frontal perception is compromised as soon as the viewing subject departs from the set of lines exactly normal to the glass panes. So from any oblique view, which means almost every view, the structure's complex hierarchy of component system falls out of perfect alignment. This is, however, not unfortunate. The structure forms an elegant web of components, a collage against the Louvre pavilions beyond. Of course, this is a signature photograph that appears over and over again. So indeed, perhaps the overlay of textures is exactly that which subdued the complaints that the pyramid would be a synchronic aberration rather than a diachronic evolution. Now finally, as the Louvre's new primary entry became necessary to violate one of the pyramid's sides to accommodate passage. Opening the flank was solved structurally, but the platform inside is notably inadequate for the tremendous volume of visitors descending into the museum. It is significant that in the two later buildings, in Miho and Berlin, the entry sequences are the primary motivation in the composition of the buildings. At Miho, the extended entry sequence goes literally through hill and dale. Visitors go across a plaza, through a tunnel, to arrive into a lush secret valley, up a monumental stair, and then into the central hall, whose tetrahedral roof has been gently lifted up and fragmented, allowing interstitial spaces for viewing the landscape beyond. So the vernacular and the experiential coexisting with the geometric. At Berlin, the glass envelope is configured entirely by the site. After much political acrimony in locating the museum, it fell to renovating the existing Zughaus and building a new addition on a small leftover parcel behind it, quote, between two shinkels, the Altes Museum and the Neuwalk. The transparency of the exhibition hall becomes a vehicle then for the building to become part of an urban passage between them. To configure the building sculpturally in response to sight is radically at odds with the Louvre, in fact, a dialectical opposite. As environmental reflections, experiential distortions, material limitations, and functional demands fall away in importance, the pyramid remains resolutely and classically detached from its worldly surrounds. The dilemma of the Grand Pyramid can be illustrated in polarities that have long surrounded the concept of the crystal. Historian Joseph Maschak has asserted that the concept of the crystalline in minimalist sculpture, and he mentions Pei specifically, lay within its claims to pure rationality. Yet while the crystal has been used most prominently within architectural history as a symbol for the inflexible knowledge of nature, particularly by Viollet-le-Duc and his superimpositions of rhobohedrons as granite crystals, many equivalent dimensions of the crystals are found in expressionistic work. A more extended history of the symbology of the crystal, beginning in biblical and medieval narratives, provides mystical and even occult evocations. Rosemary Blutter traces the crystal in both Jewish and Arabic legends to Solomon's temple. Built entirely of glass floating on a bed of water, the palace revealed whether the Queen of Sheba was a woman or a demon by providing a reflection from underneath her skirt. The crystal and its architectural metaphor, the glass palace, was a symbol for Solomon's esoteric gnosis. Jungian psychology tells us that the crystal is exhibits a unified opposition which had the potential to communicate more authentically through mechanisms of paradox rather than rational communication. Blutter contends that to express their fantastic imagery, Scheerbart and Taut used the crystal's association with fluctuation, paradox, and fluidity. I need to keep it a bit briefer, but for Pei, even quoted by Saul LeWitt, who worked for him in 1955 and 1956, geometry was a vehicle for zero-order neutrality, the final point in the journey from representational reference toward abstraction. By neutrality, the pyramid would transcend. By virtue of attaining a sublime form, all meaning and all reference would be confounded. Now, certainly contemporary critics disagreed. Several commentators noted that the implicit association of the Grand Pyramid to the Egyptian obelisk in the Place de la Concorde was a very real remnant of France's Napoleonic imperialism. The critic François Chaland nicknamed the president Mitterrand I. But in this difficult question, it's finally to the public realm to which we must return for this quintessentially public monument. What is the symbolism of the Louvre in the end? On July 3, 1988, the Grand Pyramid du Louvre was opened to predictably great international fanfare. Also predictably, Mitterrand again immediately seized the symbolic mantle of the new Louvre and hosted the international G7 economics summit inside the museum. Ultimately, however, the symbol could not be easily co-opted. After the opening of the museum, the avalanche of criticism in the popular press stopped suddenly. La guerre est finie, noted the same François Chaland, observing the reaction of the press. Le Figaro, which had attacked the pyramid almost on a daily basis on the cover page, celebrated its own anniversary at the Louvre the same month of the museum's opening. The following day, the newspaper's headlines proclaimed the pyramid marvelous. Even the intellectual media agreed. Quote, "How many times has one heard of the pharaonic expenses of the former president? The famous pyramid, so decried when unveiled for the first time, has become to the same extent as the Eiffel Tower, a universal symbol of France, a modern France whose culture has been enhanced." Thank you.
Thank you, Annette. Sorry to rush. We're just trying to keep everybody, we have a cutoff at 11:30 for lunch. So quickly, I'll introduce. Sorry, maybe we can get back to that in the Q&A. Next up is Brett Schneider. Brett was educated as both an architect and an engineer, a graduate student at Princeton University, completing a Master's of Engineering in 2000. He's currently an assistant professor at the Rhode Island School of Design, Department of Architecture, and a senior associate at Guy Nordenson and Associates in New York, where he's worked since 1998. Brett told me he's also collaborated on several projects with Harry Cobb, so I think there is a kind of Pei connection there. Brett, why don't you come up? Thank you.
So I may actually step away from reading my paper in the interest of time, but I actually wanted to do a couple things. First, I'd like to thank Sen-Quan and the GSD for inviting me here. And I want to follow up on something that Eric began this session with. When he showed the undergraduate thesis of Ieoh Pei, I think it's really important to understand the kind of empiricism that's applied to technology in that early project. And that implies a kind of DNA of the way that technology is embraced by the practice thereafter, you know, and a real engagement in order to turn technology into a tool. And, you know, as an engineer teaching in a school of architecture, you know, there is a frisson between, you know, the kind of disciplines of technology and the discipline of architecture, often where we find ourselves stuck in hierarchies, either where technology needs to be this foreign thing controlled for the purposes of design, or that thing which we give ourselves over to control. And the important thing you see, particularly in the work from the beginning in this case then, is a engagement and a turning that technology into a tool, such that it is complementary rather than ever in opposition. And that's really important to keep in mind. So I'm going to be looking at two projects early from the 1950s, the Hyperboloid, and from the 1960s, the FAA towers, kind of, I guess you could say in many ways, the stripped down projects of the early years that lay out, I would say, an arc in terms of that relationship to technology, and in particular, kind of a tectonic development. So I'll begin with the definition. This is from Edward Seckler in his 1964 essay, Structure, Construction, and Tectonics. And it's worth noting that this definition is the one that Kenneth Frampton also refers to in several places. So when a structural concept has found its implementation through construction, the visual result will affect us through certain expressive qualities which clearly have something to do with the play of forces and corresponding arrangement of parts in the building, yet cannot be described in terms of construction and structure alone. For these qualities, which are expressive of a relation of form to force, the term tectonic should be reserved. So, you know, the important thing for us to keep in mind is that there are three considerations: structure, construction, and then this tectonics, which relates to both of them but is not limited to them. So let's begin with, again, we're going to be talking about the Hyperboloid on the left and the FA towers on the right. And so, there we go. Hyperboloid, 1954 to 1957. In a few iterations between 3,800,000 to 5 million square feet, 80 to 108 stories in its iterations, and upwards of 1,500 feet in height. So this was an unbuilt proposal for a tower at the site of Grand Central Terminal in New York, produced in solicitation of Robert Young, who was the new chairman of the New York Central Railroad, which at the time was facing financial difficulties. They were looking to take advantage of kind of unused assets, of which the airspace above Grand Central was one. And so, you know, Zeckendorf and Webb and Knapp were asked to produce a scheme, in this case to replace Grand Central with a grand office tower. And so this is that tower, 5 million square feet. This is the iteration, 108 stories tall. This is a model produced by Ieoh Pei's team in the early days of that project. You'll see that the tower has an exterior structure, comes down Park Avenue, coming to its terminus in a new transit center below. Now, what's important here is that this project, of course, was front page news in the New York Times, but in text only. All right. So even though the kind of general description of this project existed, that is its size, its grandeur, images of both the project and the models produced were not published. There is discussion in some sources of Ieoh Pei's actual interaction with both Architectural Forum and Architectural Record in terms of why this was not published, but the important thing is that it wasn't. And so it's not really part of the architectural discourse of tall buildings in the 1950s. Now, this building is actually truly remarkable because, as it's named the Hyperboloid, that is its form. Now, what that means is that this is a hyperbolic paraboloid enclosed about itself. The sloped columns that you see on the perimeter are the ruling lines of that hyperboloid in two directions in order to form what we more commonly today call a diagrid perimeter structure. This was unheard of in the day. You see in the middle the section of the building, and on the right the floor plan. So the floor plates were upwards of 60,000 square feet in order to both appeal to large corporate renters, but also, you know, it was an argument that that changing floor plate would have an advantage of being able to appeal to many different types of tenants. And of course, all these floor plates much larger than the typical layouts available in the Empire State Building, of which it would surpass by several hundred feet. Now, the hyperbolic paraboloid itself is not uncommon to structural design of this time. This is Felix Candela, but this was used in shell concrete construction. And there are two reasons for that. One is that, of course, the opposition of curvature gave a structural advantage in three-dimensional interaction, but also because of its ruled surface, this is something that one could make the forms out of stick pieces. So, you know, we see here the stick pieces that are laid up in order to make this constantly and doubly curving final form. The kind of application of the hyperboloid as a three-dimensional wrapping around structure is limited to a few towers by Zhukov in Russia and then in the Soviet Union. This is the first of them in 1896 for an all-Russia exhibition in Novograd. And here you see this similar wrapping of straight line elements around that enclosed hyperboloid form. So, you know, while not an invention totally, its application in a office building was unprecedented and very rare. Now, that's important because, you know, that idea of this being a hyperboloid means that it's a structural tube. And the idea of the structural tube, as it is, you know, kind of as it is accredited to Fazler Khan, didn't come into play in his work until the early 1960s. You know, you see here is first use of it in the DeWitt Chestnut building in 1961. And it's also important to note that Ieoh Pei's own work doesn't kind of follow along in terms of high-rise development this idea of three-dimensional structure. On the right is, you know, Mile High Center in Denver, which becomes a more Misesian tower. Now, this all ties back to the 1950s because the kind of context of progressive tall building is dominated by the contribution of Mies, whose own Seagram building from 1954 to 1958 was directly contemporary to the hyperboloid. Now, Mies's post-war towers in the US and Canada were marked by the development of a structural expression of the frame in the skin of the building, right? The refined abstraction and representation of the idea of the frame through exposed wide flange sections on the surface. You know, this is a discussion that we're all quite aware of. And I'd actually like to quote Colin Rowe about this in relation to the international style of both Korb and Mies from the Chicago Frame, his essay from 1956. In the international style, there is no fusion of space and structure, but each in the end remains an identifiable component. And architecture is conceived not as their confluence, but rather as their dialectical opposition, as a species of debate between them. So there's actually a preceding line to this, and Rowe says in that line that an autonomous structure perforates a freely abstracted space, acting as its punctuation rather than as its defining form. And it's this word autonomous that I want to come back and reconsider. So Rowe refers to autonomy in the context of tectonics and not in the actual functioning of the structure, right? And I say that because if you look at Mies's work as an engineer, you begin to see that the functional structure is indeed autonomous, but only to the degree to which it's hidden. Because when it is revealed, it becomes just as rhetorical as the applied elements that are put on the face of Seagram. So this is IIT, Crown Hall, and you know the signature move is to put the roof girders above the roof. Now, as an engineer, that's completely backwards, because that means that as these girders are flexing and their top flanges are going to compression, they want to buckle laterally and torsionally. In order to deal with that, in this case, these girders have to be much heavier than they would otherwise be. A series of stiffeners are placed in order for moment connections to the minor framing to keep them stabilized, right? This is kind of undue burden, one might say, on the structure, but important for the rhetoric of the application. Another example of this is in the convention hall proposed for Chicago. And in the iconic rendering, there's a kind of equality of this field of equal framing placed against the equality of this kind of democratic gathering, you know, a political convention. And what that hides is that actually the distribution of force within that frame above goes through large-scale concentrations as it gets to the edge, as we're putting lateral load on this, and it's acting as a large-scale beam, and how that force in the roof then gets transferred down to these point supports along the base, right? All of that obscured because that is the rhetoric of the project, right? So the structure here becomes just another tool in that rhetoric, and that means that its function is kind of much more complex. Now, in Seagram, that plays out in the following way. So on the left is the structural section through that building, and here the structure has no relationship really to the architecture of the building. There are in the lower portion a series of shear walls which come up, which then become braced frames with a series of moment frames throughout. So it is a very ad hoc, very practical structure for the needs of this project, but it doesn't really engage the architecture in any significant way. Now, this couldn't be, you know, more different, I think, in the case of the hyperboloid. And in order for us to really get at that, we need to think about a difference here between the actual approach that we see in figures like Mies and what we'll see in projects like this. And my colleague Guy Nordenson refers back usually in many of his essays about tall buildings to the difference between the Eiffel Tower and the Statue of Liberty. And he goes on to talk about these things, and he recognizes a difference between several modes. These are differences of kind and not of quality or effectiveness. One kind of work, the dialectical, holds the technology and architectural meaning apart, allowing the meaning to emerge gradually, while the other approach, the monolithic, aims to fully integrate them in an organic whole. The architecture and technical meaning are certainly separate in the case of the Seagram building, as I've indicated, both at the conceptual level between the space and the frame, and at the practical level where, you know, the hybrid lateral system over the height of the building bears no relationship to the architecture. In contrast, the structure of the hyperboloid, both in form and function, is fully integrated with the architecture, both contained and expressed in the geometry of the hyperboloid form. It can be said that the complexity of the conceptual layering evident in Mies is absent, but, you know, as Nordenson notes for other cases, this too is a difference of kind rather than of quality. The refined use of simple geometry is a hallmark of Pei's work, and his ability to find meaning of using singular geometry to contain multiple systems of meaning is indicative of sophistication not evident in the simple shapes of the result. Now, both Rowe and Nordenson identify opposites to this dialectical work of the moderns, Frank Lloyd Wright for Rowe and the Chicago Towers of SOM for Nordenson. Given the above identification of the hyperboloid as an example of a tube structure, comparison to the latter bears additional discussion. For example, John Hancock building by Bruce Graham and Faz Khan of 1964 to 69 could be considered similar to the hyperboloid in many ways. Both stand apart from their context as objects, they taper, they express large-scale bracing structure on their surface. The work of Faz Khan in particular is significant in the development of tower structures in the late 20th century for the development of the concept of the building as a structural tube. Here, where the idea of the structure of the building is pushed to the perimeter, where its extension from the center makes it much more effective as a cantilever against wind and or seismic lateral forces. It's important to note the lineage of Khan to Myron Goldsmith and then back to Mies through IIT. You know, because as we progress from Mies forward, the refinement and sophistication of his work is gradually replaced by the efficiency of Kahn's engineering without any kind of corresponding development of the tectonics of the architecture. The resulting architecture is reductive to direct structural expression as the kind of spatial and tectonic concepts do not see equal attention. And, I would identify that, there is a very strong structural expressionism in projects like the Hancock Tower, but it doesn't carry the same, I think, degree of kind of conceptual refinement that we see in Mise's own work. Now, on the right, of course, there is that sophistication on the structural side, which is not to be diminished, all right? But that's something else entirely. So on the right, this is a series of graphs by Faz Khan for steel structures above and concrete structures below, describing, the application of these tube types for the very tall. And so you see the types on the right referring to various forms of tube structures that we see many of in the particularly 70s and 80s and still see versions of now. So, where this takes us is that, the degree of integration that we see in the hyperboloid, right, is not equaled by Graham and Faz Khan. And the problem in this case, of course, is that the hyperboloid was not built. And since it wasn't published, it has effectively disappeared until only recently. So what becomes valuable in looking then at another one of these projects, which is largely more technological, the FAA towers, is that this was built. And I want to call attention to a few figures here on the list. Michael Flynn, whose name we've heard, the great master of enclosures at Pei Cobb and Fried, and Reg Huff, the other kind of great master of concrete. I've had the opportunity to work with both, and their base of knowledge is truly remarkable. One of the questions is, how does a practice become a kind of school? One thing to keep in mind is it becomes that through a commitment to engagement, right? Mike Flynn, Reg Huff, they engage these systems, these materials, they work them through, they internalize them, they understood them, and then they applied them, right? And again, it's that empiricism which is important. So during the Kennedy administration, Najib Halabay became the head of the FAA and convened a set of advisors, including Gordon Bunshaft, Eliel Saarinen, Henry Dreyfus, and William Walton, amongst others, which culminated in a competition of ideas that then resulted in Ieoh Pei and Partners Commission for the design of a standard for air traffic control towers to be built across the United States. Before Halabay left the FAA in 1965, 16 towers were constructed from the 13 variations available in this standardized model. The towers were to be standalone to maximize their function and free them from the possible conflict with terminal buildings, which might require asynchronous expansion or revision. Each tower was to be composed of 3 module parts: a base building, a tower shaft, and a cab, allowing for variation in size from 3,500 to 17,000 square feet and 60 feet to 100 feet in height as necessary for the size and demands of each airport. Each of these components were subjected to a meticulous design process, considered both in isolation and in assembly. The critical design decision was to remove the equipment and technicians housed in the dark rooms from the tower shaft and move them to a base building. The base building was then mostly buried to emphasize the tower in the landscape and to allow for it to vary in size as necessary, independent of the tower itself. The shaft only contained the stairs, the elevator, and service shaft, with its tapered shape resulting from a wide base for lateral load resistance and a flare at the top to meet the cab. Construction was tested for cast-in-place, precast, and slip-form concrete solutions, with a specialized formwork developed to allow for efficient and high-quality concrete using a slip form. The cab was developed to be prefabricated as a unit. Pentagonal in plan to prevent internal reflection given the lack of parallel glazed surfaces. Single glazed 360-degree enclosure for optimum optical clarity with a specialized air system to prevent condensation or frosting. A custom rail at the interface to the shaft of concrete to support a cleaning bucket out of the sight line. And a unified console to reduce clutter in the cab for more efficient and less distracted work. So, the kind of kit of parts picture we see on the right, which kind of shows the myriad of pieces that went together and the fitting together of those pieces to be prefabricated and brought to site as a whole. This is something that, the story goes that Mike Flynn was dispatched to Canada to meet with representatives of the aerospace industry and to coordinate their own interests and processes with them. Again, internalizing this vast array of technical demands compacted to within this single element and finding ways to use geometry to simplify that process, but also then to kind of order and allow their inclusion. So here, and again, seen from the inside of that cab, looking out, and you really get a sense of the kind of cleanness and clarity of that as an important space of work, and the importance of that work in terms of protection of flight. Now, the innovations in this case may not be structural, but are certainly constructional. In particular, the refinement of the casting of the tower and the pre-assembly of the cab. The process of refining the tower shaft form included the rental of a warehouse in Brooklyn to physically lay out and test the profiles, right? To test them such that not only were everyone comfortable, but so that nothing was left to uncertainty. And the prefabrication of the cab recalls the industrialized approach of automotive or industrial design, seldom successful in architecture, which many of us are familiar with in the case of Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion homes, which are great in idea and troubled in their implementation. Now, while the application of this model ended in 1965 when Halley left the FAA and his successors sought to reduce construction costs under pressure from the U.S. Comptroller General, the intent and execution of the design was very much in keeping with the evolving requirements of air traffic control. The AAA Journal published an issue devoted to the issues of airports in September of 1970. In general, several of the articles noted the demands of increased flight traffic both on the requirements for tower placement and modularity and clarity of workspace for air traffic control given the rapidly growing traffic to be controlled. Both issues were well addressed by the Pei and Partners design, and photographic evidence of this was included in a comparison of the typical, on the left, kind of condition in the control tower, and that typical condition in the Pei tower. Again, this refinement and clarity of that workspace given the reduction of distraction. So, one might equate that kind of refinement of geometry, which in the end the comptroller saw as over-aestheticization and as additional cost, but that was part and parcel with this minimalization of distraction, this maximalization of use that I think this tower epitomizes. And I think it's also important here that this is a project that was built. So in the case of the Hyperboloid, it didn't become part of the discourse, but it also didn't go through the additional testing that would have been required in order to make it buildable. We don't know how that project might have evolved if it had become real. Whereas here we can actually see the end result of that refinement. We can see, the effect of the engagement of technology, the internalizing of it, the making it part of the process, and the use of geometry both to kind of simplify, but also to again focus that implementation of technology. So in both of these cases, this represents successful examples of that what we would call the monolithic or the integrated tectonic model, where the structural and the constructional meaning are integrated with that architectural or tectonic meaning. So let us go back to Seckler, and this is how he concludes. Among our three related concepts, tectonics is the one most autonomously architectural, which is to say the architect may not be able to control the conditions of structure and construction as completely as he would like to, but he is the undisputed master of tectonic expression. Here his performance assuredly be discussed on his own terms, and his artistic personality and character manifest themselves most clearly. Accordingly, in architectural criticism, tectonics would seem to deserve as much consideration as some of the other elements which have been singled out for special discussion, chief among them space. It will be important, however, to remember that whatever is singled out is isolated by a deliberate act of the critic for the purposes of analysis. So to speak of architecture in terms of tectonics alone would be as one-sided as to speak of it in terms of space alone. So in architectural criticism, particular consideration is given to those aspects that are architectural, tectonics and space, among other evolving concerns. As a structural engineer teaching both architecture and engineering in a school of architecture, I would hope that my own perspective might be more expansive without suffering from my own disciplinary limitations, and thus particularly relevant for the types considered here: the very tall tower and the almost purely technical and standardized air traffic control tower. These are well suited to the monolithic mode, given the relative importance of structure and construction these types require. What sets these two projects apart from the other projects in this mode discussed by others is that rather than simply flipping the hierarchy to emphasize structure and construction at the cost of reducing more typically architectural concerns, all issues are balanced in importance and integrated in both cases. This is exceptional and should not be discounted given a relative simplicity of the resulting forms. The means of this exception appear to be derived from an interest in and command of geometry that is both taken as a tool to simplify and a lens to expand. This is common to all Pei-related work, both Ieoh Pei personally and his associated firm continuing as Pei Cobb Fried & Partners today. Seen through these two projects, the critical detail becomes the large-scale or whole integrating of the structure, construction, and form, resulting in a monolithic tectonics that deserves more attention for its success on these terms. Now, I actually want to finish by talking about some of my own interaction with Pei Cobb Fried. This is a project which is a collaboration between Guy Nordenson, the bridge engineer Ted Zoli, and Harry Cobb. This is 7 stems. It's a 2,000-foot broadcast tower that was a project that we did together in the early 2000s. So I was the project engineer for this. Though I know the mechanics of this quite well. In this case, and this is where this idea of the overlap of both technology and kind of shall we say form making becomes quite complex. And the story here is a hard one to tell. So a couple things. The structure in the end is just as its name implies. It is 7 stems, 7 cylinders, each 2,000 feet long and sloped in space. This looks like a sculpture. It's not. The way this works is that if you take any 2 cylinders in the wind and you vary the space between them, this is a graph of the drag. So at some point, about 2 to 3 diameters apart, their combined drag is less than the individual drag of the 2. And that means that that is a kind of optimum position. Now, the wind is not equal in all 360 degrees. So here in blue, you see the windrows for that location in New York. And the kind of technical system we were developing was an idea of taking this idea of combining these pairs, but doing it for a group of 7. And so Ted Zoli's contribution was a mathematical calculation that would enable us to produce what we called the drag rows. And in this case, it was for a prototype where the 7 stems were simply rayed around the center, with one also at the center. And so the drag rows in that case would be this red. Now, the idea, had we gone ahead, and in the end we were simply a negotiating ploy for the TV consortium in New York as they were negotiating with Silverstein for the Freedom Tower, or World Trade Center 1 as I'd prefer to call it, was that what we would do is take the area of maximum wind, which is about 3/4 height, and we would optimize the relationship of the stems to match in inverse the windrows. We would then splay them out as wide as possible at the base, and the resulting sculpture would be the form of the building. So, this is something derived from engineering, but guided by that very precise and insightful eye of Harry Cobb relative to the geometry of this. So, that same kind of thinking is what I see when I look back at the hyperboloid, where you see Ieoh Pei taking something that was unheard of in terms of a structural application and fundamentally making it part of an architectural proposition. And it's actually, to me, a terrible loss that this project didn't appear in the discourse, for 50 years, because in many ways it would have changed, I think, the discussion in the 1950s about architecture and structure. And I'll end there. Did I go too long?
A little bit. We're good. Thanks, Brett. All of these presentations are so fascinating, we don't want to stop them. Our next speaker, Les Robertson, will not go more than 20 minutes, but because we have to have lunch. Let me just say a few things about Les. Les is an internationally acclaimed structural engineer who's transformed urban and rural landscapes through innovative designs over 60 years. Among his notable designs are the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, the U.S. Steel headquarters in Pittsburgh, I believe, the Bank of China Tower with Ieoh Ming Pei, the Shanghai World Financial Center with Kohn Pedersen Fox, the Suzhou Museum, Meyerson Symphony Center with Ieoh Ming Pei, Museum of Islamic Art in Qatar, and the Miho Museum. The last of these are with Pei Freedom Partners. A member of the National Academy of Engineering, a distinguished member of the American Society of Civil Engineers, Robertson has received numerous awards and honors, including the I. Struct E Gold Medal of the UK and the ACSC's Outstanding Projects and Leaders Award. He was ENR, Engineering News Record Man of the Year, and the first recipient of the Henry C. Turner Prize. Robertson is a distinguished alumnus of the University of California, Berkeley, and a recipient of the doctoral degrees from Lehigh University, Notre Dame, RPI, and the University of Western Ontario. I'm going to just let you come up here and do your presentation. Thank you, Les.
Well, lunch is in 20 minutes, and I thought I would, how did you do this? I thought I would just talk about Ieoh Ming Pei and try to leave time for discussion afterwards. Is that okay? Great. Found it. So I guess I should go back and say, I know Ieoh Ming Pei pretty well. I've known him for many years, and his family and my family are very close. I have lunch with Ieoh on average every other week. Just the two of us, we get together and talk for a couple of hours and drink a small bottle of wine, of course, and do the things that you do with Ieoh Ming Pei. So I think I know him pretty well, and maybe more appreciative than many of the great things that he's done for us. So there's so many projects, and this is an example of Ieoh Ming Pei and his engineering. When he showed me this project, there were no diagonal lines in the facade. And I said to him, well, that's fine, but we need to have a transverse structure because you have very long span structures of, whoops, pushed the wrong one. I'll learn how to do it here. There we go. A very lower one, right. Very short span here and very long span here and very short span there. And the glass was going to deflect differently in the wind, so you need a transverse structure. And he said, what does that look like? And I just drew a line across the paper, and he said, fine, and produced this in almost 0 time, this design. He has an extremely quick mind. He can pick up on an idea and carry it forward, and then he carried that across this part of the facade as well. So inside you see it's relatively straightforward, and you can see the transverse structure is quite prominent as viewed in the inside as well. The Bank of China Tower, this is the final design, I guess you should say. And he and I went to Hong Kong and met with the executives of the Bank of China and showed him this design. And they said, oh, we think the structure's wonderful, but we're not going to have it shown in the facade. It's going to be inside the building, the glass is going to go over it, and you won't see it. Because these are the, oh gosh, I'm very bad at this. These are the symbols of X, and X is not good, and symbol of death, so we can't have them. We went back, Ieoh and I went back to New York. We sat in his garden outside his house and drank wine, or maybe we had whiskey, I forget which. And I said to him, well, you know, these are very heavy and much heavier than the real structure, and you could make them a lot lighter. They are what are called refuge floors, and which means that they are places where the stairs go down to the refuge level and exit on the refuge level, and then you get another stair to continue on down. They're basically a fire haven in the middle of the building. So we went back and presented this idea, and I explained to them that these are not X's, these are diamonds. And the bank said, we're a 21st century organization, and they're diamonds, so that's what we're going to build. So anyway, the Bank China Tower, the shape of the building, he called me on the phone one morning, and I just take a little sidestep here, and that is, I don't know that we ever exchanged paper as we talked. We didn't send each other letters or emails, or I don't think IM even knows how to use email, but anyway, we certainly didn't send emails. We talked. And so he called me on the phone, and I went over and see him, and before I went there, he said, it's a big building in Hong Kong, and my father was very, all the usual things he would say. So I did a little homework, and we'd done other work in Hong Kong, so it was easy for us to move forward. The bracing in the building falls in this pattern. None of all of this bracing exists on any given floor, of course. But the key is the fact that we have bracing inside the building, not on the facade, expressed in the facade, and that the bracing intersection in the facade is out here, and our intersection is there, there, and there, and how to integrate that. So we worked up a system of integrating them with big concrete columns in the corners, so that each of these frames are plane frames in structural steel. They're not three-dimensional frames at all. They're plane frames, but integrated in the concrete to form a three-dimensional structure. This is a typical elevator in Hong Kong at that time. I rode this elevator many times. Notice the fact that people are just sort of standing there and casually holding on. But if your eye goes down to look at this fellow down here, right? Notice the safety harness and etc. You know, it's just nothing there. It was the nature of the construction at that time. And our introduction to Hong Kong, by the way, was all these buildings on the far side. We did all those for Eric Cummins. And again, you see, this man on the right is the general superintendent of the steelworkers. No protection whatsoever. Zero. When Shinji Shumakai decided to build in Japan, they came to the United States to interview Minoru Yamasaki and Ieoh Pei. They went first to Yama's office and got no farther. And Yama got the commission to do the sanctuary building there. And Tsuboi was the structural engineer. He'd worked with him in the past, and an excellent structural engineer. And so time went by, and unfortunately Yama passed away, and construction continued, and this bell tower came up as a part of the rest of the construction, and Ieoh was the natural choice. I had nothing to do with the structural design of this tower, but I was in Europe working on a bell tower for Philip Johnson, and so I designed all the bell mounts and went to the bell manufacturers, and they were working on the bell mounts for this tower, and I realized immediately that their understanding the seismic loading on bells was very different from mine, so I redesigned all of them for them. And so the bell mounts are my design. There's the bells up there. The rest of it, of course, is Tsuboi, who was a fantastic engineer. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you've seen this in the past. The most interesting part, I think, was that the entire shape was developed by Ieoh and his staff. How, I'm not really sure. Most of you probably don't really understand, but the Rock and Roll is underneath here. And the Hall of Fame is a little structure up there. This is a big entry area and so forth. And Ieoh is a great communicator, great communicator. He could talk to anybody, any walk of life, and speak to them, and they understand, and he understands them. And so he went into the South and studied rock and roll. I think what he really studied was jazz myself, but maybe he thought it was rock and roll. I don't know. He ever knew what rock and roll was, actually. But anyway, he did this building, and to us, the most interesting part was that these big surfaces and very flat, and so we preloaded all of the loading points of the truss work with heavy weights, and then shored the weights, and then built the rest of the structure, the steel structure and aluminum and glass work on top of it, so that there's no deflection. It was built absolutely flat in the plane of the triangle. There came the question of this rock and roll is out in the water. And I pointed out to Ieoh that rather large vessels come into that area, like barges and ships and so forth. And if they run into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame will fall, not the ship or the barge. It will be the building. And I proposed that we build some kind of a little device to keep them out. And Ieoh said, fine, we'll put in piling underwater so they run into the piling, not the building. He's a very practical guy. Miho Museum, fantastic project. We got well into the design, and then he came when he said, Les, he said, I have to make a presentation, so would you put the bridge together right away so that, because I'm not prepared to do it with the buildings. So they rough models of the buildings and a pretty decent model of the bridge were put together, and all kinds of folks came there to see it and admire it. Many people have asked me about the shape of the arch. You know, it must have some structural significance, and if there is, I've never found it. I just drew it. And I thought it was all finished, and then Ieoh said, well, it looks pretty flat, so can't you make it out of, you know, laminated plates instead of one plate in each face? It's a box structure. So I said, sure. So we laminated plates onto the broad faces, both sides. Cable size is pretty arbitrary. I started with using the structural requirement here, and then we got towards the bottom. I just arbitrarily increased the size because I thought it provided a kind of ending to the cables. Totally illogical, of course, but I think it was successfully, visually very successful. Okay, I got to quit because we're going to have a little discussion, right?
For a few minutes. I think we've got 6 minutes. I'm not sure what. Okay. Thanks for being at this morning session. Thanks for all the great presentations.
Thank you very much.
I feel terrible that we rushed you. I think these would have been, you know, just fine if they'd gone longer as you'd planned. We've only got a few minutes left. A couple of things struck me amongst the 4 presentations. I think, you know, we've got 2 historians, 2 engineers, maybe Annette counts in both categories. So some really interesting perspectives on the early work, on some specific projects, on the nature of collaboration. And I think that's what's really kind of special about these events, is sort of convening this group of people that can tell these stories. I think it's been noted several times that some of these stories have never been told, you know, that there isn't that much scholarship, and this conference is meant to sort of make up for that. And so, but I've heard that there's no school of Pei, which I think is kind of curious. an architect that has such a prolific body of work, an architect that's been so influential and launched so many careers, that there's no school of Pei. And I was struck by Les, you're saying there was no paper. You didn't exchange emails because it was just a conversation, so it wasn't written down. And Janet, the discussion about, not really writing a great deal, not really sort of, in a way, teaching. And a question that was brought up in the spring, actually Scott Cohen brought this up when there was a similar group convened here with Harry Cobb. He was saying, well, if a practice is a place for producing knowledge, and I think we see that, we see incredible knowledge produced, expertise, construction, techniques, and so on. And the lineage of these firms, as we saw, of people sort of working at Pei's office and sort of transferring knowledge. We heard a little bit about the office culture, which I think is fascinating, to hear how individuals sort of pooled knowledge, how they distributed knowledge, how they then went out in the world, some of the discussion from last night. Scott asked in the last conference, how is the firm like a school? Like we at the GSD, we're interested in producing knowledge, we're interested in producing expertise, we transmit that knowledge. How could we think about the practice of the firm as a kind of place where knowledge is produced? How might that expertise be cultivated, and how might it be better transmitted? I wonder if any of our panelists would be willing to discuss that from the question of practice versus academy, from the question of producing technical knowledge and then transmitting it.
Well, yeah, I'll take a little bit of a swing at this. I think some of that has to do with what is your project as a designer. It seems that I.M.'s interest was not in the kind of rhetorical framing of his practice and the dissemination of that. It was, the actual engagement. And some of the, since I work as a consultant, I engage with lots of different practices. And so, for instance, Sejima Nishizawa, when we did the Toledo Museum of Art, their lieutenants were very interested in doing a book about the making of that project. But, the idea of construction is not interesting to Sejima Nishizawa. That's not how they frame their practice. And so that never came to be. So, I think this tends to be, how do you see yourself participating? Korb, who meticulously, controlled his presentation of self, was because that was the way in which his practice had kind of greater meaning. It just doesn't seem to be as important. And the other thing about that is that when your practice involves any kind of empiricism, like really deep testing, it's messy. So to what degree do you reveal that mess, or to what degree do you sanitize it, or to what degree do you say, I'm not going to present it, I'm going to just keep doing it? And it's a prioritization.
Yeah.
I know we struggle with that in terms of disseminating the engineering work we do, because you're on to the next thing. You can't think about how to present what I've already done.
Yeah, I think that Janet.
I'm thinking back so many times when people would come, as I mentioned earlier, they'd come with great design skills but no technical knowledge. And that included I.M. himself. He came to Zeckendorf with no experience in building, and then within a couple of years had $500 million of work in construction. The firm has, in many cases, been seen as kind of a finishing school for young architects. They would come in without this critical knowledge, and it would be developed in-house. The difference with academia, of course, is this is a business. It has to, it's not a question of a failing mark or a passing grade, it's what actually has to operate. I think in all of it, what is critically important there is I.M.'s encouragement of this. It has to come from the top. There has to, if it were not his interest, it wouldn't have happened. And he placed enormous trust in young architects, just enormous, and gave them great freedom. And he would always say, oh yes, but I had very lucky, I had great people to work with. And it was absolutely true. But given those opportunities, almost without exception, the architects rose to the occasion. And so, it was something that they grew into. I think that's critically important in this.
Yeah. we were just chatting before about this question of R&D, and it seems like there was a lot of R&D going on in the firm. Whether it was called R&D, it was probably called something else, material testing, or now I feel like the industry has sort of shifted away from that kind of hands-on testing towards having consultant experts, contractors. We've sort of shed some of that sort of hands-on. Now, materials and methods or means and methods, rather, is not what the architect does. The architect controls design intent. The contractor controls the means and methods. It seems like there was a moment where means and methods were very much part of the Pei ethos. It was about sort of specifying the wood. It was about specifying the aggregate. Do we see a kind of shift from a moment where that kind of means and methods was sort of natural to a kind of contemporary way of practicing that might look at other models? I think last night Moisen was sort of speculating about the different practices that were being presented here and what future practices might be. Do you guys have any thoughts about a kind of the evolution of an R&D type practice into a contemporary practice and how that might sort of resonate with the current sort of building industry?
Well, I think it's interesting that this symposium makes clear the different roles of different entities in gathering knowledge, in representing the knowledge, and collecting the knowledge. And what's been fascinating is, I'd never seen these hyperbolic structures before. It's just a complete revelation. I never knew about the concrete work that he did. That is just really astounding. I think there's probably a lot more R&D going on than we know, right? I certainly know that, for example, in Philadelphia, Karen Timberlake does an enormous amount of R&D. And so the job of disseminating that information, of collecting the rhetoric, of disseminating the information, seems to be situated right here at this moment, which is kind of exciting, to be part of that. It also is a great testament, I think, to Ieoh Pei's modesty, that there was not a kind of office manufacturing of publication and marketing on these kinds of levels, which we see so often in some firms now. It's a kind of constant image making that he seems not interested in. He seems more interested in the research itself. And so it's an interesting position of the conference, of the collection of the work. And thank you for having this.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
I'd like to say too, in this the development of concrete and Mike Flynn's involvement, the awareness of the amassment of that kind of in-house knowledge was exactly the impetus to develop curtain wall in-house. It just went from one technology to a different technology.
Yeah, no, that's clear. I think it's clear in terms of the kind of investment in that kind of expertise. I know we're sort of running out of time. Les, I wanted to ask you a little bit, because you've come to the GSD many times to speak in my class, and every time you show projects, but you also tell these great stories. And every time I learn something new about the people that you've worked with and the projects that you've worked on. I think one thing that I've learned, sort of sitting here today and last night, is, I am beyond the kind of body of work and beyond the kind of work that we know or don't know because it was published or wasn't published. He did sort of, I think, present a way of sort of being in the world, of being a kind of professional in the world. And I think, Les, you've sort of spoken so beautifully and poetically about how you've worked with him. Do you have any last sort of thoughts about, before we break for lunch, how working with him as a person in the world, as an architect, as a leader?
Well, we all know that Ieoh had an engineering background, but it was a long time ago. And so his engineering background was maybe not so different from someone who started without any engineering education whatsoever. He was not a great reader in my experience. I mean, for example, if you sent him a 2-page letter, he might read the first page and then he'd get bored really fast, with good reason often, and he was not a big meeting attender either, In terms of communication, he could, but to sit there like we are today and listen, he was not really good at that. It was not his way. He was a great communicator, as I said, from all walks of life. He could even talk to professors. You can talk.
Imagine that. Okay. Well, maybe with that, we should call it a close. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to our audience. Thank you so much.